What if I told you the moment you stop chasing them is the moment they finally feel your absence? Not because you disappeared, but because for the first time they can't feel your need holding them in place. It's not when you cry. It's not when you beg. It's not when you try harder. It's when you go quiet, not out of pride, but out of peace. That's when the avoidance nightmare begins. Because the one who stayed through silence, confusion, and mixed signals just chose themselves. And that changes everything. There's a misconception about avoidantly attached people that they don't want love, that they're cold, uninterested, or emotionally unavailable by choice. But that's far from the truth. The reality is avoidants do crave connection just like anyone else. They feel deeply, they long for closeness, but the moment that closeness begins to feel too real or too vulnerable, it triggers something within them. Fear. Not fear of the other person, but fear of exposure, fear of losing themselves, fear of being dependent or hurt. So they pull back, not because they don't care, but because caring feels dangerous. Avoidants often grew up in environments where vulnerability was either unsafe or ignored. Maybe they were taught to be self-sufficient to a fault, praised for their independence while their emotional needs went unseen or invalidated. So they learned a quiet rule. Don't need too much, don't rely on others, keep your distance and you'll be safe. Over time, this survival tactic becomes their relationship style. They feel most in control when things are slightly out of reach, when there's enough emotional space to breathe. But that very space, that distance they create, becomes a double-edged sword. It keeps them from getting hurt, yes, but it also keeps them from truly connecting. When they meet someone who leans in, someone warm, expressive, and emotionally available, they might be drawn in at first. It feels good to be wanted. It feels good to be seen. But the moment things feel too close, too intense, they start to feel suffocated. This is when they begin to pull away. They may disappear for a few days, become vague in their responses, or suddenly question the entire relationship. It's not because their feelings aren't real, it's because their wiring tells them that closeness equals danger. What makes this dynamic painful is that avoidants often don't understand what's happening inside them. They tell themselves, I just need space, or this isn't the right person, or something feels off. But the truth is, what feels off is their own discomfort with intimacy. Deep down, they're battling two conflicting desires, one for love and one for safety. And in that tug of war, safety often wins. This is why it's so important to understand that avoidants are not heartless. They are not playing games. Most of them are not trying to hurt the other person, but their protective instincts, built over years of emotional survival, get activated the moment they feel like they're truly being seen. It's ironic, the very thing they want is also what terrifies them most. So they crave connection, but fear the cost of it. They want intimacy, but sabotage it before it has the chance to deepen. And unless they recognize this pattern and choose to work through it, they'll continue to run, not just from others, but from themselves. The anxious person in a relationship is often the one who loves with intensity, patience, and a kind of emotional resilience that sometimes borders on self-abandonment. They're the ones who feel everything deeply, who sense even the slightest shift in tone, the delayed reply, the change in rhythm. To others, it may look like overreacting, but for someone with an anxious attachment style, it's not just sensitivity, it's survival. From a young age, they may have learned that love was inconsistent. Affection was given, then taken away. Attention came with conditions. As a result, they grew up believing that love must be earned, chased, or held onto tightly before it slips away. This belief bleeds into their adult relationships. They give more than they receive, often without realizing it. They're the ones sending long texts trying to fix what went wrong, apologizing just to keep the peace, or excusing behavior that's clearly hurtful just to avoid abandonment. They show up again and again trying to prove they're worth staying for. They hope that if they can love hard enough, stay patient long enough, or be better, then maybe, just maybe, the other person will finally meet them where they are. What's so heartbreaking is that anxious individuals are not naive or weak. They see the inconsistency. They feel the anxiety every time there's emotional distance. But they stay, not because they're desperate, but because they're deeply hopeful. Hopeful that their love can heal, that their presence can earn permanence, that this time it won't end the way it always does. They also tend to overfunction in the relationship. If the avoidant partner goes cold, they turn up the warmth. If there's a withdrawal, they lean in harder. They plan the dates, start the conversations, do the emotional labor. And when none of it works, they don't immediately get angry. They often blame themselves. They think, maybe I said too much. Maybe I'm too emotional. Maybe I need to just give them space and things will get better. What they don't see in those moments is the slow erosion of their own self-worth. The more they chase, the more they shrink. The more they tolerate emotional breadcrumbs, the further they drift from the kind of love that nourishes rather than depletes. But they keep waiting. Because the anxious person often believes that love means enduring, sacrificing comfort for connection, trading stability for moments of closeness, mistaking anxiety for passion. And yet, underneath all that effort is a longing so human it hurts, to be chosen without having to fight for it, to feel secure without second guessing, to rest in love rather than wrestle for it. The anxious person isn't too much, they're just giving too much to someone who doesn't know how to receive it. When someone who is avoidant pulls away, the common advice is to give them space and let time do the healing. But what many people don't realize is that distance alone does not resolve deep attachment wounds. Avoidants aren't just dealing with a momentary need for breathing room, they're wrestling with a lifelong fear of closeness and emotional vulnerability. And while time may create temporary calm, it does little to shift the internal wiring that causes them to push love away in the first place. What actually begins to disrupt the avoidant pattern is not silence or patience, but the moment when the anxious person stops chasing. There's a certain emotional dance that happens in anxious avoidant dynamics. One person pulls away and the other rushes in to close the gap. This reinforces the avoidant's fear that love is overwhelming, and it confirms the anxious person's belief that love must be pursued. Both people feel stuck. The avoidant becomes more distant and the anxious becomes more desperate to reconnect. It's a loop that feeds itself over and over, and it can go on for years if left unbroken. But when the anxious person, who's been the glue holding everything together, suddenly steps back, everything changes. This isn't just about silence or detachment, it's a shift in energy, in intention, in identity. It's not I'm ignoring you to get a reaction, it's I'm done sacrificing my peace to maintain a connection that costs me myself. That kind of shift doesn't just create distance, it breaks the rhythm the avoidant has grown comfortable with. And that disruption is what finally forces them to confront the space they thought they needed. In that silence, a mirror appears. The avoidant no longer gets to feel desired without offering reciprocity. They no longer get the safety of emotional distance without the cost of disconnection. They're left with themselves and the truth becomes unavoidable. They miss the comfort of being loved without pressure, supported without judgment. They begin to feel the weight of what they've taken for granted. This moment can be jarring for the avoidant because it uncovers something they often don't expect: loss, real loss, not just of a person, but of safety, of certainty, of emotional security that was always available but rarely reciprocated. And for the anxious partner, this is where healing begins, not in being cold or manipulative, but in choosing themselves with quiet clarity. They realize that no amount of waiting, texting, or fixing will make someone ready to show up. True change happens when the emotional balance of power resets, when the person who always gives finally pauses and says, This is not my burden to carry anymore. And that pause is what disrupts the entire dynamic. It creates the discomfort necessary for awareness, and awareness is the first step to healing. Not time, not space, but action. Especially the kind that says, I love you, but I refuse to lose myself to love you. When an anxious person finally walks away from an avoidant partner, the entire dynamic of the relationship shatters. Up until that moment, there has been an unspoken pattern playing out. The anxious partner pursues, reaches out, and works hard to hold the relationship together, while the avoidant partner maintains emotional distance, often retreating when things become too intimate. This push-pull interaction becomes the norm, creating a false sense of stability. The anxious person may feel anxious but connected, and the avoidant may feel safe but still engaged. But when the anxious person reaches their emotional limit and quietly walks away, not with drama, not with threats, but with calm finality, the avoidant is faced with something they rarely confront: the loss of control over the dynamic they've grown to rely on. The avoidant person often feels in control because they know, consciously or unconsciously, that the anxious partner will always come back. There's a security in knowing that no matter how distant they become, no matter how long they take to respond, or how emotionally unavailable they act, the other person will still be there. This safety net gives them permission to continue avoiding vulnerability without fully losing the connection. But when the anxious partner steps out of the game, that safety net is gone. The avoidant is left standing alone in the silence they once claimed to need. And for the first time, they must sit with the consequences of their own emotional withdrawal. This moment is not just confusing for the avoidant, it's terrifying. They often don't realize how much they relied on the anxious partner's consistent effort until it disappears. They may have mistaken the anxious person's commitment for neediness, their vulnerability for weakness, and their emotional expression for pressure. But now, in the absence of that energy, they feel something entirely new: absence. And that absence brings clarity. The avoidant begins to see how much they were actually held and supported even when they weren't fully present. The silence that once brought comfort now feels hollow because the emotional reassurance they used to receive is no longer being freely given. This is often the first time the avoidant partner truly feels the loss, not because the anxious person stopped loving them, but because they stopped proving it. They stopped chasing, they stopped waiting. And in doing so, they broke a pattern the avoidant had learned to depend on. That rupture is powerful. It's the moment when the avoidant has to choose: continue hiding behind fear and lose a genuine connection, or confront their discomfort and finally grow. Some may attempt to return, but now the power dynamic has shifted. The anxious person, once consumed by fear of abandonment, has found clarity in detachment. They're no longer playing the same emotional game, and that shift sends a shockwave through the entire relationship, one that cannot be undone or ignored. When the anxious person finally walks away, it's not a strategy, it's a surrender, but not to the relationship, to themselves. They're not walking away to manipulate or provoke a reaction. They're walking away because deep down, they've realized that staying any longer would mean betraying their own needs. For so long, they've made love conditional on effort. They've overextended, overexplained, and overcommitted to someone who meets them with inconsistency. They kept trying because they believed that maybe if they just did a little more, said the right thing, or gave the right amount of space, the other person would finally come around. But eventually, even the most patient heart grows tired, not out of bitterness, but from exhaustion. That's when they walk, not out of anger, but out of clarity. This moment is often misunderstood. From the outside, it might seem like the anxious partner suddenly changed overnight. But the truth is, this decision comes after countless quiet heartbreaks. It's after waiting for a text that never came, accepting apologies without change, and showing up for someone who only shows up when it's convenient. They gave more than they received until one day they asked themselves a hard question: what am I actually fighting for? That question doesn't come from ego, it comes from a deep need for self-respect. Walking away isn't about teaching the avoidant partner a lesson. It's about finally learning their own. It's about recognizing that love isn't supposed to feel like convincing someone to care. It's not supposed to feel like anxiety in disguise. And it's not supposed to cost your peace, your dignity, or your emotional well-being. For the anxious person, this is one of the hardest things they'll ever do. Because letting go of someone they love goes against every instinct they've developed. But at some point, they realize that clinging to the idea of what the relationship could be is keeping them from experiencing what it truly is. That's when the dynamic shifts. The avoidant, used to being pursued, is suddenly met with silence, but it's not a weaponized silence, it's a boundary, and that boundary speaks volumes. I care about you, but I care about me more. It's a powerful shift from fear to self-worth. It's a declaration that love should never be one-sided and that emotional availability is not too much to ask. When the anxious person walks away in this kind of strength, they stop operating from lack and start acting from value. What begins as heartbreak turns into healing because they're no longer trying to be chosen. They've chosen themselves. And that's not about winning. It's not about ego, it's about ending a cycle that was never fair to begin with. They finally understand that the right person won't need to be chased, fixed, or convinced. The right person will meet them with the same kind of effort, presence, and emotional courage they were always so willing to give. Healing from anxious or avoidant attachment doesn't happen by waiting for the other person to change or by simply ending a relationship. It begins with awareness, the kind that forces you to look at yourself honestly, without shame but with full responsibility. Whether you tend to chase love or push it away, the common thread is that something in your past taught you to protect yourself from emotional pain in very specific ways. Maybe you learned to cling tightly because love felt unpredictable, or maybe you learned to detach because closeness felt overwhelming or unsafe. These responses aren't flaws, they're strategies. But the same strategies that once kept you safe are now keeping you stuck. Awareness is recognizing that your emotional responses are not just reactions to your partner, they're echoes of what you've lived through. It's seeing that your anxiety isn't just about how long it takes someone to text back, it's about a deeper fear of being forgotten or abandoned. It's realizing that your need for space isn't just about needing quiet. It's about the discomfort that arises when someone gets too close and you fear losing your independence. Healing starts when you become conscious of these triggers and start to question them instead of letting them control you. But awareness alone isn't enough. It must be paired with boundaries. Boundaries are not about building walls or pushing people away. They're about defining the space where you can exist with self-respect and emotional clarity. For the anxious person, boundaries might look like resisting the urge to chase someone who goes silent, and instead sitting with the discomfort without trying to fix it. For the avoidant, it might mean learning to stay in a conversation when emotions rise instead of withdrawing or shutting down. These boundaries protect you, not from love, but from repeating the same painful cycles over and over. Boundaries also teach others how to treat you. When you set a standard for how you want to be loved and stick to it, you filter out the relationships that thrive on confusion, inconsistency, or emotional imbalance. That's not rejection, that's self-protection. And it's through that protection that healing becomes sustainable. You stop outsourcing your emotional safety to someone else's behavior and start taking ownership of how you show up in love. Healing doesn't mean becoming perfect or never getting triggered again. It means recognizing the patterns when they show up, responding differently, and learning to sit with discomfort rather than letting it drive your decisions. It's hard, it takes time, but it also creates space for a new kind of love, one that isn't based on survival, but on mutual respect, emotional maturity, and real connection. Whether you're single, in a relationship, or walking away from one, the work always starts with you, because no matter how much love you give or receive, it will never feel safe until it feels safe inside of you first. So if you've ever felt like you're too much for someone who gives too little, if you've loved deeply and still felt alone, if you've been the one holding on, hoping they'll finally choose you, let this be the moment you choose yourself. Because when the anxious walks away, it's not a loss, it's a turning point. It's the moment the cycle ends. It's the day peace replaces panic. It's the first breath of a life where your worth is no longer negotiated in someone else's silence. And for the avoidant, when that silence finally echoes back at you, when the person you thought would never leave finally does, that is your moment too. Not of punishment, but of possibility. The opportunity to finally face what you've been running from, your own heart. Whether you've loved anxiously, avoided closeness, or simply lost yourself trying to be enough, this is your reminder. Real love doesn't require you to beg. It doesn't ask you to shrink. It doesn't punish your debt. It meets you fully, fearlessly, willingly. To walk away, not to hurt them, but to heal you. Not to make them miss you, but to remember who you are, because the love you've been giving to someone else, it's time you give it to yourself. And the moment you do, everything changes.